The merciless August sun blazed over Willow Springs, casting the main street in shades of burnished gold and deep shadow. Dust motes danced in the heavy air as wagons creaked past weathered storefronts, their wheels grinding against earth baked hard as pottery by months without rain. The scent of leather horse sweat and distant sage carried on what little breeze stirred the desert town, mixing with the aroma of freshly baked bread from the bakery and the sharp tang of metal from the blacksmith's forge. Elise Brennan adjusted the worn fabric of her blue gingham dress and tightened her grip on 7-year-old Felix's small hand. The boy pressed close to her side, his dark eyes wide, as he watched the bustling preparations for Founder's Day. A brass band tuned their instruments on the hotel porch, their discordant notes floating above the cheerful chaos of merchants hawking last-minute wares, and children darting between the legs of adults too absorbed in commerce to mind their steps. The late afternoon heat was oppressive, pressing down on the crowd like a heavy blanket. Women fanned themselves with whatever came to hand, while men sought shade beneath the wooden awnings that lined the main thoroughfare. Despite the discomfort, the mood was festive. Founder's Day was one of the few occasions when the entire community came together to celebrate their shared survival in this unforgiving landscape. "Stay close, Felix," Elise murmured, though her voice was barely audible above the din. She had learned to keep to crowds' edges to avoid drawing unwanted attention. In a town where whispers followed unmarried women like persistent shadows, a young widow with a child walked a precarious line between respectability and ruin. Every interaction was scrutinized, every friendship questioned, every moment of independence viewed with suspicion by those who believed a woman's place was firmly under male protection. The weight of constant vigilance was exhausting. For 3 years since Thomas's death, she had measured every word calculated, every gesture always conscious that one misstep could result in Felix being taken from her. The territorial laws of 1881 were clear about such matters. Single women, especially those with children, existed at the mercy of male relatives or community charity. Elise had neither, which made her position even more precarious. A sudden movement at the end of the street caught her attention, a freight wagon hitched to a massive bay gelding that stamped and snorted with increasing agitation. The driver, deep in animated conversation with another man, seemed oblivious to his mount's distress. Foam flecked the horse's muzzle, and its eyes rolled white with barely contained panic. Something's wrong. Elise thought, memories of Thomas stirring unbidden in her mind. Her husband had possessed an uncanny ability to read horses, always knowing when trouble was brewing in their small stable. "Animals sense things before we do, Elise," he had told her countless times during their brief marriage. "They feel danger in the very air changes we're too civilized to notice anymore." Thomas had been a gentle soul, ill-suited to the harsh realities of frontier life, but determined to make a go of it for her sake. His death from fever during their first winter had left her not just widowed, but stranded in a place where survival required skills he had never possessed and connections she had never been allowed to form. Felix tugged at her skirt, his small voice cutting through the painful memories. "Miss Elise, that horse looks scared. Maybe we should tell someone." Before she could respond, the hitching post splintered with a crack like gunfire. The massive gelding reared high iron shoes flashing in the brutal sunlight, then bolted straight down the crowded main street. The heavy freight wagon careened behind it, like an instrument of divine wrath scattering people in all directions. Screams erupted from the crowd as mothers snatched their children to safety, and men shouted warnings that were lost beneath the thunder of hooves on packed earth. The runaway bore down on Elise and Felix with terrifying inevitability. Time seemed to stretch like heated glass as every detail crystallized with horrible clarity. The wild terror in the horse's rolling eyes, the way Felix's small body went rigid against hers, the metallic taste of fear flooding her mouth. She could see death approaching with mathematical precision, could calculate the exact moment when those iron shoes would crush them both into the unforgiving earth. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, her arms locked protectively around the child who had become her whole world. The hoofbeats grew deafening, closer, ever closer, until she could feel the vibrations through the soles of her worn boots. In that moment, her mind filled with Thomas's voice once more. "Take care of yourself, Elise. Don't let them make you disappear." Then a figure materialized from the chaos like smoke given human form. The Apache scout moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy natural law, his long black hair streaming behind him as he intercepted death's path. In his hands was a coil of rawhide rope, and his moccasined feet made no sound even at a dead sprint. There was something almost supernatural about his speed and precision, as if he had been placed there by fate itself to stand between innocent lives and senseless destruction. He reached the panicked animal just as destruction thundered toward them. With movements born of a lifetime's partnership with horses, he leapt and caught the bridle, his boots digging furrows in the dust, as 1 ton of terrified horseflesh carried them both forward. The beast reared again, powerful muscles bunching with bone-crushing force. But the man held on with iron determination that spoke of battles fought and won against impossible odds. "Easy, brother," he said, his voice carrying an otherworldly calm that seemed to penetrate the horse's terror. "Easy now. You're safe. No one will hurt you here." The hooves crashed down mere inches from Felix's upturned face, so close that the boy could smell iron, and Leather feel the wind of their passage ruffle his hair. With a final desperate heave that strained every muscle in his lean frame, the scout managed to wrench the horse's massive head to the side, sending the animal crashing into the mercantile's hitching rail instead of into human flesh. Wood splintered like rifle shots, and the wagon slewed sideways against a water trough, its cargo of mining equipment scattered across the street, but its deadly momentum finally broken. Silence fell over the street like a heavy blanket broken only by the labored breathing of man and beast and the settling creak of damaged wood. The scout stood with one hand still gripping the bridle, the other pressed against his ribs where the horse's shoulder had struck him. Despite what must have been considerable pain, his primary concern seemed to be calming the still trembling animal. His dark eyes met Elise's for a single heartbeat, intelligent, searching, oddly gentle in such a fierce face. She saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of what she represented: vulnerability, in need of protection, innocence, that deserved preservation. It was a look that spoke of someone who had made such protection his personal mission, regardless of the cost to himself. From the shaded porch of the Silver Spur Saloon, Conrad Pike watched the scene unfold with calculating, pale blue eyes. The mine boss was a thick-set man in his 50s, his expensive clothes and soft hands marking him as someone who profited from others' labor rather than engaging in it himself. A cigar smoldered between his fingers, and his smile held all the warmth of winter steel. Everything about Pike suggested a man accustomed to getting what he wanted regardless of who might be hurt in the process. Beside him, Sheriff Edwin Crowther tapped his tin star with thick fingers in a rhythm like a funeral drum. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of too many years under the desert sun, and his mouth was set in perpetual disapproval of anything that didn't serve his interests or those of his benefactor. The relationship between Pike and Crowther was an open secret in Willow Springs. The mine boss provided the money and influence, while the sheriff provided the legal authority to ensure that money and influence went unchallenged. Interesting development. Pike murmured smoke, wreathing his words like incense at a dark ritual. Very interesting indeed. That Apache's been making himself quite visible around town lately. You want me to do something about it? Crowther asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun butt. Not yet, Pike replied thoughtfully. But keep watching. A man doesn't risk his life for strangers without reason. There might be more to this situation than meets the eye. The Apache scout Cheveyo Elise recalled hearing someone call him, "Release the horse," and stepped back as several townsmen moved forward to secure the animal and right the overturned cargo. He simply nodded once to the crowd and began melting toward the gathering's edge with the same fluid grace he had displayed in action. "Wait," Elise called before she could stop herself, her voice cutting through the crowd's relieved chatter. Heat rose in her cheeks as dozens of eyes fixed upon her, but gratitude overrode embarrassment. "Please wait. Thank you. You saved our lives." Cheveyo paused, his expression as unreadable as carved stone. When he spoke, his English was precise, with only the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of education received in multiple languages. The boy faced danger. No child should endure such terror alone. Felix stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of youth, apparently unaware that his rescue had been witnessed by the entire town. "You're the fastest person I ever saw. How did you know exactly what to do?" Something flickered in the Apache's dark gaze, pain perhaps, or distant memory. Speed helps, but recognizing the right moment to act matters more than raw velocity. Horses are like people, they respond to confidence and calm, not force and shouting. His words carried the weight of experience, and Elise found herself studying his face more carefully. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of someone who lived close to the land. Scars on his hands spoke of hard work and harder times, but his eyes held a depth of compassion that seemed at odds with the harsh world that had shaped him. Before she could respond or ask the questions forming in her mind, Sheriff Crowther's heavy hand fell on her shoulder like a lead weight. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his office despite its false courtesy. "You and the boy ought to exercise more caution regarding your positioning. Accidents have a way of befalling folks who don't mind their proper station in this town." The threat wrapped in concern was unmistakable, and Elise felt Felix press closer to her side. The boy might not understand all the adult undercurrents, but he could sense danger as clearly as the horse had sensed it moments before. "We weren't doing anything inappropriate, Sheriff," she replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "Of course not." Crowther agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. Still, a woman alone with a child faces numerous dangers in a frontier town like Willow Springs. Fortunate that proper folks maintain vigilance over decent order and moral standards. His gaze shifted to Cheveyo with naked hostility, and the two men regarded each other in silence heavy with unspoken history. The tension between them was palpable, crackling like heat lightning before a desert storm. Elise sensed that this was not the first time their paths had crossed, and that previous encounters had not ended amicably. "Some folks," Crowther continued, his eyes never leaving Cheveyo's face, "seem to think they can insert themselves into situations where they don't belong. That kind of presumption can lead to unfortunate consequences for everyone involved." Cheveyo's expression remained neutral, but something dangerous flickered behind his calm exterior. A man's duty is to protect the innocent, regardless of the color of their skin or the opinions of those who profit from their suffering. The words were quietly spoken, but they carried the force of absolute conviction. Several townspeople had gathered close enough to overhear the exchange, and Elise could see them exchanging meaningful glances. Everyone in Willow Springs knew about the uneasy relationship between the Apache reservation and the town, just as everyone knew that Pike's mining operations had encroached on tribal lands more than once. Finally, Crowther touched his hat brim in mock courtesy and walked away, his boots loud against the wooden sidewalk. but his message had been delivered, and Elise felt its implications settle over her like a shroud. She was being watched, judged, and found wanting by those who held power in this community. In the days that followed the incident, Elise began to notice Chevello's presence around town in ways she hadn't before. He would appear at the market when she was buying supplies, always keeping a respectful distance, but somehow managing to be nearby when other men looked at her with calculation in their eyes. She observed how he interacted with the merchants, always polite, paying in honest coin, speaking only when spoken to. There was a dignity about him that commanded respect even from those who might otherwise look down upon an Apache in their midst. His presence was oddly comforting. For 3 years, Elise had navigated Willow Springs' social landscape entirely alone, always conscious that she lacked the protection most women took for granted. The knowledge that someone was quietly watching out for her welfare was both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because she genuinely felt safer. Troubling because she couldn't understand why a stranger would take such risks on her behalf. Felix, with a child's uncomplicated acceptance of new friendships, began seeking out opportunities to speak with their rescuer. He would linger by the river, where Chevello often sat in the evenings, asking questions about horses and the desert, listening with rapt attention to stories of Apache traditions and the old ways of living in harmony with the harsh land. "He's teaching me to read animal signs," Felix told Elise one evening as she tucked him into his narrow bed. "Did you know you can tell if it's going to rain by watching how the horses behave? And he says the ravens talk to each other about where the best water is. They have a whole language just like people do, but most folks are too busy to listen." Elise smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, but she also felt a growing awareness of the man who was quietly becoming part of their lives. She found herself looking forward to the brief conversations they shared when their paths crossed discussions that began with weather and local events, but gradually deepened into something more substantial. Chevello had an uncanny ability to listen, really listen, in a way that made her feel heard for the first time in years. It was during one of these encounters, as she purchased fabric at the general store, that she truly began to understand the depth of his character. "The boy seems happier lately," Chevello observed quietly, appearing at her elbow as she examined bolts of cotton cloth. His presence no longer startled her. It had become as natural as breathing, a constant she had unconsciously come to rely upon. "Felix has always been drawn to those willing to teach him," Elise replied, selecting a piece of sturdy blue fabric suitable for work shirts. The cloth was more expensive than she could easily afford, but Felix was growing out of his clothes with alarming speed, and she refused to let him appear in public, looking like a ragamuffin. "He lost so much when Henry died. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for him, if I can give him everything he needs to become the man he should be." "You are more than enough," Chevello said with quiet conviction that brooked no argument. "But a child benefits from seeing different kinds of strength, different ways of moving through the world. You show him courage in the face of hardship, persistence when others would surrender. Others can show him different skills, different perspectives." His words carried no criticism, only understanding. And Elise found herself truly looking at him for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of someone who lived close to the land and depended on his own skills for survival. Scars on his hands spoke of hard work and harder times, but his eyes held a depth of compassion that seemed at odds with the harsh world that had shaped him. "You speak of children as if you've known them well," she said carefully, sensing deeper currents beneath his casual words. "I had a daughter once," he replied, his voice growing soft with memory and pain. She would be near Felix's age now had she lived to see this summer. Her name was Little Star, and she had your boy's curiosity about the world. Always asking questions, always wanting to know the why behind everything. The grief in those simple words was raw, despite the time that had surely passed, and Elise felt her heart constrict with shared pain. Loss was something she understood intimately, the way it carved hollow places in your chest that never quite filled again, and the way it made you simultaneously treasure what remained while fearing its loss. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly, meaning it completely. Did you lose your wife as well?" "Ayanna," he confirmed with a nod. "She died defending Little Star when cavalry troops raided our winter camp 3 years ago. I was away carrying messages for the Indian agent trying to maintain peace between our peoples. When I returned..." He fell silent, but the agony in his eyes completed the story more eloquently than words ever could. Loss teaches us the true value of what remains. Chevello continued after a moment, his voice steadying with visible effort. "Your devotion to Felix honors both your hearts and the memory of those who came before. A child who knows he is loved grows stronger than one who merely knows he is fed and clothed." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Conrad Pike himself, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden floor as he made his way toward them with predatory purpose. The mine boss moved like a man accustomed to owning everything within his reach, and his pale eyes swept over Elise with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "Miss Brennan." Pike set his politician's smile firmly in place, but failing to reach his cold eyes. "How delightful to see you in town. I trust you and the boy are well? No lingering effects from that unfortunate incident with the runaway horse?" "Quite well, thank you," Elise replied instinctively, moving closer to Chevello's solid presence. Something about Pike had always made her uncomfortable, though she had never been able to articulate exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, as if calculating her value like a piece of equipment he might purchase. Pike's pale eyes flicked between them, noting their proximity with obvious calculation. "I've been meaning to speak with you about your situation. Perhaps we could arrange a private conversation to discuss matters of mutual interest. I have some proposals that might benefit both you and the boy considerably." The implications in his tone made Elise's skin crawl, but before she could formulate a response that would discourage him without giving open offense, Chevello stepped slightly forward. "The lady appears to be conducting her business satisfactorily," he said mildly, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. "I see no indication that she requires assistance or proposals from outside parties." Pike's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the cold anger beneath his cultivated charm. "I wasn't aware that Apache opinions were solicited in matters concerning respectable citizens and their welfare. Respect is earned through actions not assumed through birth or wealth." Chevello replied evenly. "The lady has earned respect through her dedication to the child's welfare and her determination to maintain their independence despite considerable obstacles." For a moment, the tension between the two men was so thick, it seemed almost visible, crackling in the air between them, like electricity before a thunderstorm. Other customers in the store had begun to notice the confrontation, and Elise was acutely aware of the whispers and stares they were attracting. Then Pike's smile returned, though it never reached his eyes, and somehow managed to be more threatening than his momentary display of anger. "Of course," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just a hint of silky menace. "We all want what's best for the boy, don't we? Sometimes that requires difficult decisions about his future care and the influences that shape his development. The territorial authorities take such matters very seriously, I'm told." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Elise felt ice form in her stomach. Pike was letting her know that her association with Chevello had not gone unnoticed, and that it could be used against her if she continued to resist his overtures. In a society where a woman's reputation was her most fragile asset, Even the suggestion of impropriety could destroy everything she had worked to build. I'm sure they do. She managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. Fortunately, I have nothing to hide regarding Felix's care or my own conduct. Naturally, Pike agreed, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. Nevertheless, it pays to be cautious about appearances, doesn't it? Especially when a child's future hangs in the balance. After he had gone, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and implied threats, Elise found herself trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "He can't actually do anything, can he?" she asked Cheveo quietly. "I mean, Felix is healthy and well cared for. I've done nothing wrong." "In a just world, that would be sufficient protection," Cheveo replied grimly. "But Pike has money influence and the sheriff in his pocket. If he decides you're an obstacle to something he wants, he'll find ways to remove that obstacle." "What could he possibly want with us? We have nothing of value." Cheveo was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Perhaps more than you realize," he said finally. "Has Felix ever mentioned his life before Henry took him in? Any memories of his earliest years? He was so young when his parents died." Elise said, confused by the direction of his questions. "Henry said they were killed in an Apache raid, but Felix doesn't remember them at all. Why do you ask?" "Because," Cheveo said carefully, "I'm beginning to suspect that there's more to Felix's story than Henry told you. And if I'm right, Pike's interest in the boy has nothing to do with your supposed moral failings, and everything to do with something much more valuable." That evening, as twilight painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, Elise found herself walking toward the river, where she knew Cheveo would be sitting beside his small fire. She had spent 3 years being cautious, keeping her head down, avoiding any action that might draw unwanted attention to herself or Felix. But Pike's veiled threats had crystallized something that had been growing in her heart for weeks. She was tired of being afraid. Tired of walking on eggshells, tired of measuring every word and action against its potential consequences, tired of feeling like she was constantly one mistake away from losing everything that mattered to her. Cheveo rose as she approached, and she noticed how the firelight caught the strong planes of his face, highlighting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the quiet strength in his bearing. He was a man who had endured terrible loss, but had not allowed that loss to destroy his capacity for compassion. "You're troubled," he observed, gesturing for her to sit on a smooth stone beside the fire. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had learned to read people as easily as he read the desert's moods. "Pike made his intentions clear today," she said, settling her skirts around her with hands that shook slightly despite her efforts to appear calm. "He's going to use our friendship as an excuse to question my fitness as Felix's guardian." "And what will you do?" The question was asked without judgment, simply a request for information. But it forced Elise to confront the choice she had been avoiding for days. "I don't know," she admitted, staring into the dancing flames. 3 years ago, I would have stepped away from any association that might endanger Felix's security. I would have thanked you politely for your help and made sure our paths never crossed again, no matter how much it hurt. And now I find myself wondering if security bought with isolation is really security at all." She looked at him directly, seeing understanding in his expression that gave her courage to continue. "Felix has grown more confident, more curious, more alive since we've known you. He asks questions about the world beyond Willow Springs, talks about possibilities I never dared encourage him to consider. I can't bring myself to take that away from him, regardless of the consequences." Cheveo was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames, as if seeking guidance from their ancient wisdom. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration and deep conviction. There may be a way to protect both Felix's inheritance and your right to raise him, he said slowly. But it would require trust between us and courage from you that goes beyond anything you've had to demonstrate so far. What kind of trust? The kind that binds families together even when blood does not, he replied, meeting her eyes directly. Apache law recognizes bonds of choice as strongly as bonds of birth. If you were willing to become part of my people, Felix would gain protection that Pike's money cannot touch and his influence cannot circumvent. Elise's heart began to race as she understood what he was suggesting. Marriage adoption into the tribe, a new identity that places you beyond the reach of territorial laws Pike has learned to manipulate for his own ends. Cheveo turned to face her fully, his expression serious but gentle. It would not be a false arrangement entered into for convenience alone. Apache marriage carries sacred obligations to protect, to honor, to share both hardships and joys as true partners. I would not ask such a thing lightly, nor would I expect you to accept without understanding its full meaning and implications. The proposal was so different from Pike's crude suggestions that it took Elise several moments to fully process it. This was not a man seeking to possess or control her, but one offering genuine partnership in the face of overwhelming odds. Why? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You barely know us, and you've already risked so much by involving yourself in our problems. Why would you be willing to take on even greater responsibilities for people who are essentially strangers? I know enough, Cheveo said quietly, his gaze never wavering from hers. I know you work your hands raw to provide for a child who is not your blood, but whom you love, as if he were born from your own body. I know you face each day with courage, even when that courage costs you dearly, even when it would be easier to surrender to despair. I know you could have given Felix to the territorial authorities when things became difficult, but chose struggle over the easier path of abandonment. He paused, his gaze growing distant with memory. My wife and daughter died 3 years ago in a cavalry raid on our winter camp. I have carried that grief like a stone in my chest ever since, wondering if I could have prevented their deaths, if I had been there to protect them. But watching you with Felix, seeing the love you give so freely to a child who needed a mother's care, it reminds me that healing is possible, even when we think our hearts are too broken to mend. His honesty was devastating in its simplicity, and Elise felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the depth of loss they shared. Here was a man who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep fighting to find reasons to hope, when hope seemed like the cruelest delusion of all. If I agreed, she said carefully, testing each word before speaking it aloud, what would happen to us? Where would we live? How would we survive? I know nothing about Apache ways, and Felix is just beginning to understand the world he was born into. The reservation has federal protection that even Pike cannot circumvent easily, Cheveo explained. You and Felix would be recognized as tribal members with all the rights and protections that status provides. As for survival, the Apache have endured in this desert for countless generations. We would not let you want for necessities, and you would learn our ways as you lived them. And Felix, how would this affect his future, his prospects? He would grow up understanding both worlds, Apache and white, traditional and modern. That knowledge would serve him well, regardless of what path he eventually chooses to follow. In our culture, children are treasured not for what they might become, but for what they are in each moment. He would be safe, loved, and free to grow into whatever person his heart calls him to be. Elise stared into the fire, watching sparks spiral up into the star-filled darkness, like tiny prayers ascending to whatever gods might be listening. Everything logical told her that Cheveo's proposal was impossible, that the social barriers between their peoples were too great to overcome. But her heart was telling her something entirely different, that this man offered not just protection, but partnership, not just survival, but the possibility of genuine happiness. "I need time to consider," she said finally, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. "Of course," Cheveo replied without hesitation. "This decision will change all our lives forever. It should not be made hastily or without full consideration of its implications." But even as she spoke the words, Elise knew her choice was already made. The only question was whether she had the courage to act upon it, to take the leap of faith that would either save them all or destroy everything she had worked to build. The next morning brought crisis in the form of Sheriff Crowther's heavy fist pounding on her door before dawn had fully broken over the desert horizon. Elise woke to the sound of harsh voices and trampling boots, her heart immediately racing with the certainty that their time had run out. "Open up official territorial business." Crowther's voice boomed through the thin walls, carrying the full weight of legal authority, and barely contained violence. Elise grabbed her wrapper and opened the door to find the sheriff, flanked by 2 of Pike's men, all 3 looking grimly satisfied about whatever mission had brought them to her threshold at such an ungodly hour. Behind them, she could see other townspeople beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion, but careful to maintain a safe distance from whatever drama was unfolding. "Arcasker Miss Brennan," Crowther said, formally producing a folded document from his coat pocket, with the flourish of a man who enjoyed exercising power over others. "I have here a warrant for the temporary custody of the minor child, Felix Laurent, pending a hearing on his proper guardianship under territorial law." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to maximize their legal impact, while minimizing her ability to respond effectively. "On what grounds?" she managed to ask, though her voice sounded thin and frightened, even to her own ears. "Concerns have been raised about your moral fitness as a guardian." Crowther replied with obvious satisfaction, relishing his role in her destruction. "Specifically your association with undesirable elements that may pose a corrupting influence on the boy's proper development as a citizen of this territory." Behind him, one of Pike's men, a lean, cruel-faced individual called Rattler, grinned with predatory anticipation. "Morning, ma'am," he said mockingly. "We're here to collect the boy and transport him to more suitable accommodations while the authorities sort out his situation." "You can't do this," Elise said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm and reasonable. "Felix has done nothing wrong, and neither have I. We're citizens of this territory entitled to due process under the law." "The law says different," Crowther replied coldly, clearly enjoying her distress. "Now, step aside and produce the boy, or we'll add obstruction of justice to the charges being considered against you." But before the confrontation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the morning air with quiet authority that somehow commanded more respect than all of Crowther's bluster. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Sheriff." Cheveo appeared from seemingly nowhere, moving with that fluid grace Elise had come to recognize and depend upon. He was not alone. Hotham, an elder she had seen at the river, accompanied him along with 2 younger Apache warriors, whose presence immediately changed the dynamic of the encounter. All 4 men were armed, but their weapons remained holstered in a display of confident restraint. "This is none of your concern, Apache." Crowther snarled his hand, moving instinctively toward his gun, in a gesture that revealed both his fear and his willingness to resort to violence. "On the contrary," Hotham said calmly, his English formal but perfectly clear, despite his advanced age. Any matter concerning members of our tribe becomes our concern under federal treaty obligations that supersede territorial authority in such matters. The woman and boy aren't tribal members. Rattler sneered, apparently unable to comprehend that the situation had shifted beyond his understanding. Are they not? Cheveo asked mildly, producing his own official-looking document from beneath his shirt. According to these papers filed yesterday with the Territorial Office of Indian Affairs, Elise Brennan and Felix Laurent were formally adopted into the White Mountain Apache tribe under provisions of the Treaty of 1871. As tribal members, they fall under federal jurisdiction, not territorial authority, in matters of family law. Crowther's face went purple with rage as he snatched the papers and examined them with growing disbelief. That's impossible. Such adoptions require weeks of paperwork investigation, approval from multiple authorities, require the consent of tribal leadership and the individuals concerned. Hotham finished smoothly his weathered face, betraying no emotion beyond mild amusement at the sheriff's distress, both of which have been properly obtained and documented according to procedures established by federal treaty. Elise stared at Cheveo in amazement, realizing that he had spent the night not sleeping, but arranging legal protections that Pike's influence could not easily overcome. The adoption papers might be preliminary, but they created enough legal complexity to thwart immediate action and buy them precious time to strengthen their position. This won't stand. Crowther growled, his earlier confidence rapidly evaporating as he realized the legal quicksand he was stepping into. Pike will have this overturned in federal court within the week, and when he does, you'll all pay for this interference. Perhaps, Cheveo agreed with maddening calm. But until then, the lady and boy remain under tribal protection as recognized by federal law. I suggest you consult with your superiors before attempting to violate treaty rights that have been upheld by the Supreme Court itself. For a moment, violence hung in the air, like smoke from a smoldering fire, thick enough to taste and volatile enough to explode at the slightest provocation. Then Crowther apparently decided that discretion was preferable to a confrontation he might not win, especially with witnesses from the town watching his every move. "That this isn't over," he said, backing away from the door while trying to maintain some semblance of authority. "Not by a long shot. Pike has resources you can't imagine, and he doesn't take kindly to being thwarted by savages and their sympathizers." After they had gone, leaving behind only dust and the lingering scent of threat, Elise turned to Cheveo with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that left her nearly speechless. "How did you manage to arrange adoption papers so quickly?" she asked when she finally found her voice. I may have anticipated your decision," he admitted with the ghost of a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Hotham has been preparing the necessary documentation since our conversations began several days ago, hoping that you would see the wisdom in accepting our protection." "You mean this was planned from the beginning?" "Ninok. Hoped for rather than planned." Hotham corrected gently, his ancient eyes holding depths of wisdom that spoke of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters between Apache and white law. But when a child's welfare hangs in the balance, wisdom suggests preparing for multiple possibilities while praying that the best one comes to pass. Felix, who had been awakened by the commotion and had watched the entire exchange from behind Elise's skirts, stepped forward with the directness that characterized childhood. "Miss Elise," he said, his young voice cutting through the adult complexities with heartbreaking simplicity. "What's happening? Why were those men here? Are we in trouble?" Elise knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers, while trying to find words that would explain without terrifying. Sweetheart, there are some people who think you'd be better off living somewhere else away from me. But Chevello and his friends are helping to make sure you can stay with me, that we can stay together as a family. Does that mean we're going to be Apache now? Felix asked, his eyes growing wide with excitement rather than fear. In his child's mind, becoming Apache meant joining the people who had produced his hero, the man who had saved them from the runaway horse and continued to protect them from less obvious but equally dangerous threats. If that's what you want, Chevello said, gently kneeling to bring himself to the boy's eye level. It would mean learning new ways, new traditions, new responsibilities. It would mean becoming part of a larger family that extends beyond just you and your mother. Felix looked between Elise and Chevello, his 7-year-old mind processing the implications with surprising maturity. Would you be like my father? He asked Chevello directly, with the devastating honesty that only children possess. If you wished it. Chevello replied seriously, understanding that this moment would shape the boy's entire future. But fatherhood is earned through care and devotion, not simply claimed through ceremony. I would have to prove myself worthy of that title through my actions, day after day, year after year. And we'd all be together, really together, like a real family. Really together. Elise confirmed, her heart swelling with love for the brave little boy who had already endured so much loss and displacement. Forever, if that's what you want. Felix nodded decisively, his face lighting up with the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. Then yes, I want to be Apache. I want us to be a real family, all of us together. The ceremony took place that very evening by the river, with the entire tribal community gathered to witness the formal adoption. It was unlike anything Elise had ever experienced, ancient words spoken over sacred fires, rituals that connected her not just to Chevello, but to generations of Apache ancestors who had survived in this harsh desert through courage and mutual support. The transformation was profound and immediate. As Hotham placed the traditional marriage cord around her and Chevello's joined hands, Elise felt something fundamental shift deep in her chest. This was not the desperate expedient she had initially feared, but a genuine commitment to building something meaningful together, something that honored both their individual histories and their shared future. Felix was given an Apache name, Young Eagle, and formal recognition as Chevello's son. The boy's delight was infectious, his excitement at learning new words, new songs, new ways of understanding the world around him, bringing smiles to even the most skeptical tribal members. But their joy was short-lived. As the ceremony concluded and families began retiring to their lodges for the night, a messenger arrived with disturbing news that shattered the evening's peace, like a stone thrown through glass. Pike had not been idle during their day of celebration. Papers had been filed in federal court challenging the adoption on multiple grounds, and more troubling still, new evidence had allegedly surfaced regarding Felix's true heritage and the substantial inheritance he might be entitled to claim. What kind of evidence? Elise asked, cold dread settling in her stomach like a living thing. The messenger, a young Apache who worked at the territorial office and served as an unofficial liaison between the reservation and the white authorities, spoke rapidly in his native tongue to Hotham. The elder's expression grew increasingly grave as he listened, his weathered face revealing more concern than she had ever seen him display. Pike claims to have discovered documentation proving that Felix is not Henry Laurent's ward, as previously believed, but rather the illegitimate heir to a substantial mining fortune. Hotham translated carefully. He argues that such an inheritance requires federal oversight that tribal adoption cannot circumvent regardless of the child's current legal status. That's impossible. Elise protested, her mind reeling from the implications. Henry was a simple miner who barely earned enough to keep himself fed. He lived in a one-room shack and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. Where would he get documentation about mining fortunes? She stopped mid-sentence as a horrible possibility occurred to her, a thought so disturbing that she almost couldn't bring herself to voice it. What if Henry had been more than he appeared? What if his desperate poverty had been a disguise, a way to hide Felix from those who might seek to exploit a wealthy child? "We need to find out the truth," she said with growing determination, her voice gaining strength as her resolve crystallized. If Felix has an inheritance, he deserves to know about it and claim what is rightfully his. And if Pike is lying to serve his own purposes, that needs to be exposed before he can use those lies to destroy our family. Cheveo nodded gravely, his expression reflecting her own concerns. Henry spoke to me once about papers he had hidden, documents that would protect Felix if something happened to him. I assumed he meant adoption records or guardianship papers, but perhaps... Well, where would he hide such things? Hotham asked, his strategic mind already working through the possibilities. He worked the Copper Gulch mine until the cave-in that killed him. Elise said slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place in her mind. If he wanted to hide something valuable somewhere, Pike couldn't easily reach or wouldn't think to look. The mine itself. Cheveo finished, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. Dangerous, unstable, but Pike wouldn't think to search there. Too risky, too public after the accident. Then that's where we need to go, Elise said, though the thought of entering the unstable tunnels terrified her more than she cared to admit. Because if we don't find the truth, Pike will manufacture whatever version serves his purposes. Too dangerous. Cheveo protested immediately, his protective instincts warring with his recognition that she was probably right. The cave-in weakened the entire structure. One wrong step, one shifted beam could bring down what's left of the mountain on top of us. Then we'd better be very careful and very lucky. Elise replied with steel in her voice that surprised even her. Because if we don't act quickly, Pike will use whatever time he has to strengthen his position and weaken ours. I won't let him destroy our family with lies and legal maneuvering. The journey to Copper Gulch took place under cover of darkness, with Cheveo leading them through desert paths known only to his people and used for generations to move unseen across the harsh landscape. The abandoned mine crouched against the mountainside like a wounded beast, its entrance partially blocked by debris from the cave-in that had claimed 17 lives, including Henry's. The sight of it filled Elise with mixed emotions, grief for the lives lost and anger at the industrial practices that made such accidents inevitable, and a growing suspicion that what had happened here might not have been entirely accidental. Merkaltsenam. There's a ventilation shaft that connects to the main tunnels, Cheveo explained as they studied the unstable entrance from a safe distance. It's narrow and treacherous, but it should bypass the worst of the structural damage from the collapse. They rappelled down the shaft by moonlight, and their lanterns casting eerie shadows on rock walls that seemed to press in around them with malevolent intent. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old timber, and every sound echoed ominously in the confined space amplified by stone, until their whispers became shouts, and their heartbeats thundered like drums. The ventilation shaft opened into a horizontal tunnel supported by iron beams and wooden posts that groaned ominously under the mountain's weight. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling in a rhythm that seemed to count down to some inevitable catastrophe, and their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Henry mentioned a place where iron meets stone. Cheveo said, playing his lantern beam across the walls with systematic thoroughness, where the support beams anchor directly into the rock face. They found it 50 yards into the tunnel, a section where newer mortar had been used to seal a cavity in the red sandstone wall. The difference was subtle, visible only to someone who knew what to look for, but it stood out clearly once they understood its significance. Working carefully with tools they had brought for the purpose, they chipped away the false cement to reveal a waterproof pouch containing documents that would change everything they thought they knew about Felix's origins and the forces that had shaped their lives. The papers told a story both tragic and infuriating, a tale of greed, murder, and the systematic exploitation of honest people by those with the power to rewrite laws to serve their own purposes. Felix was not Henry's ward, as they had always believed, but rather the son of Marcus Donovan, owner of one of the territory's largest silver mines, and one of the few mining operators who had tried to treat his workers fairly. Donovan had discovered Pike's illegal operations, claim-jumping water theft, and systematic fraud designed to drive smaller operators out of business, and had been gathering evidence to present to federal authorities when Pike had him murdered. The killing had been made to look like an Apache raid, complete with planted evidence and falsified witness statements. But Henry Laurent had seen the truth. "Listen to this," Elise whispered, reading from Henry's final letter by the flickering light of their lantern. "Marcus died trying to protect the honest miners of this territory from Pike's greed. His son deserves the chance to finish that fight to reclaim what was stolen and ensure that his father's death was not in vain." The letter went on to detail the location of additional evidence hidden throughout the mine records of Pike's thefts, witness statements from miners who had been afraid to come forward, even photographs documenting illegal operations. Henry had been building a comprehensive case that would not only expose Pike's crimes, but also restore Felix's rightful inheritance. But there was more documents that revealed the true scope of Pike's criminal empire. He had not simply stolen Marcus Donovan's mine, but had systematically murdered or driven out every honest operator in the territory, consolidating control over the region's mineral wealth through violence and corruption. "We have to get this information to the authorities," Elise said, carefully refolding the papers with hands that trembled from more than cold. "This proves Pike has been systematically looting the territory's mineral wealth for years." But even as she spoke, the sound of voices echoed down the tunnel from the direction they had come. Pike had apparently grown tired of legal maneuvering and decided to settle matters more directly and permanently. "Tracks lead right into the mine," a harsh voice called Rattler Elise realized with growing fear. "They're down there somewhere, probably found what they were looking for." "Then we make sure they don't come back up," another voice replied, one she didn't recognize, but that carried the same casual cruelty she had heard from Pike's other men. "Cave-ins happen all the time in unstable mines. Tragic accidents, but nobody's fault, really." Cheveo extinguished their lantern, immediately plunging them into darkness, so complete it seemed almost solid. "There's another passage deeper in the mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the profound silence. "It connects to the old Apache cave systems. We can escape that way, if necessary." But before they could move, Pike's voice boomed down the tunnel with unmistakable authority, echoing off stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I know you're down there." He called, his cultured tones somehow more terrifying than his men's crude threats. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, but it's time to end this foolishness once and for all. Come out peacefully, and the boy won't be harmed. Continue this childish resistance, and I can't guarantee anyone's safety." "Like hell," Elise muttered under her breath, clutching the documents to her chest as if they were Felix himself. "You have 5 minutes to consider your options." Pike continued, his voice growing closer as he apparently descended into the mine himself. "After that, we start using the dynamite. Mining accidents are regrettably common in unstable workings, and the territorial authorities will certainly understand that such tragedies are sometimes inevitable. The threat was real. Pike had the resources and ruthlessness to follow through on it. And the isolation of the mine meant that no one would witness whatever happened in its depths. But Elise had not come this far, had not risked everything to protect Felix, only to surrender at the first sign of serious resistance. "There has to be another way," she said quietly, her mind racing through possibilities, even as fear threatened to paralyze her completely. "The Apache caves," Cheveo confirmed, his voice steady despite the danger. "But they're deeper in the mountain past some very unstable sections. And if Pike's men have the main entrance blocked, then we make sure they can't keep it blocked," Elise said with growing determination, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "You said Henry hid evidence throughout the mine. What if some of that evidence included Pike's own dynamite supplies?" Cheveo's teeth flashed white in the darkness as he smiled grimly, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. "You're proposing we use Pike's own explosives against him. I'm suggesting we create enough chaos and confusion to escape, while making sure Pike never threatens another innocent person again." She replied, her voice gaining strength as her resolve crystallized. "He's used violence and intimidation to build his empire. It's time that violence was turned back on him." It took them precious minutes to locate Henry's second cache, hidden behind a pile of ore cars in a side tunnel that branched off from the main passage. Along with more incriminating documents, they found detailed maps of Pike's illegal operations and, most importantly, several sticks of dynamite that Henry had apparently stolen from Pike's own supplies over the course of months. "Can you set these to create a distraction without bringing down the entire mine on top of us?" Elise asked, examining the explosives by the light of a carefully shielded match. "If we're very careful, very precise, and very lucky," Cheveo replied, studying the mine's structure with the eye of someone who understood both engineering and warfare. "But once we light the fuses, we'll have perhaps 3 minutes to reach the Apache caves before this section becomes extremely hazardous to our health." They worked quickly and quietly, placing charges at strategic points that would collapse sections of tunnel without destabilizing the main support structure. The goal was not to harm Pike's men, despite everything. Elise was not prepared to commit murder in cold blood, but to create enough confusion and obstruction to allow their escape while trapping Pike and his followers long enough for them to reach safety. As Cheveo prepared to light the final fuse, Pike's voice echoed down the tunnel again, closer now, and filled with growing impatience and barely contained rage. "Anna, time's up." He called, his cultured tones finely cracking to reveal the vicious predator beneath the civilized facade. "Rattler, bring the dynamite. If they want to play hide-and-seek in these tunnels, we'll show them what happens to miners who don't follow proper safety procedures." The first explosion came just as Pike's men reached the main chamber where Henry's first cache had been hidden, a thunderous roar that shook dust from the ceiling and sent shockwaves through the mountain's ancient bones. Shouts of confusion and anger followed along with the sounds of scrambling feet and falling rock as the carefully planned chaos unfolded exactly as Cheveo had intended. Elise, Cheveo, and Felix, who had insisted on coming despite the danger, refusing to be left behind while the adults risked their lives for his sake, ran through passages that grew increasingly narrow and treacherous as they descended deeper into the mountain's heart. Behind them, more explosions echoed as Pike's men apparently decided to bring down sections of tunnel in their fury and frustration. "This way," Cheveo called, leading them into a natural cave system that opened like a cathedral beneath the desert, its walls decorated with ancient Apache drawings that told stories of survival and resistance stretching back countless generations. Fresh air flowed from passages that led to the surface miles from the mine entrance, carrying the scent of sage and freedom. They emerged into moonlight near the river, gasping and covered in dust, but alive and victorious. In Elise's hands were documents that would not only restore Felix's rightful inheritance, but also expose the full extent of Pike's criminal empire to federal authorities who could no longer ignore or dismiss the evidence of systematic corruption. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Pike and whatever men had survived the mine collapse were pursuing them with the desperate fury of cornered animals who knew their time was running out. "They're coming," Felix said unnecessarily, his young eyes wide with fear, but also with the strange excitement that danger brings to children who don't fully understand its implications. "Let them come," Cheveo replied grimly, checking his rifle with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced death many times before. "They're on Apache land now, and they're no longer protected by corrupt badges or bought judges." The final confrontation took place in a clearing by the river, with moonlight turning the water silver and casting long shadows that seemed to dance with otherworldly life. Pike emerged from the darkness with 3 surviving men, all of them armed, and all of them wearing expressions of desperate fury. "You've caused me more trouble than you're worth." Pike said, his expensive clothes torn and dusty from his underground ordeal. "But it ends here. Give me those papers, and I might let the woman and boy live long enough to regret crossing me. The only thing ending here is your reign of terror." Elise replied with courage that surprised even her. "These documents prove you murdered Marcus Donovan and 17 other innocent men. The federal authorities will be very interested in what they contain." Pike's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Federal authorities. In case you haven't noticed, we're in the middle of nowhere, and I own everyone who matters in this territory. No one will ever see those papers, and your bodies will never be found." But as he spoke more, figures emerged from the darkness around the clearing, Apache warriors led by Hotham, moving with the silent grace of their ancestors, and carrying weapons that gleamed in the moonlight. They had been tracking Pike's party since the explosions at the mine, and now they surrounded the clearing like spirits of vengeance risen from the earth itself. "Where you are on sovereign Apache territory," Hotham announced with quiet authority that carried more weight than all of Pike's bluster and threats. "Your crimes against our people and our friends will not be tolerated." Pike's face went pale as he realized how completely the situation had shifted against him. "You can't touch me," he said, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. "I'm a United States citizen conducting legitimate business activities." "Murder is not legitimate business," Cheveo replied, stepping forward with his rifle ready, but not yet raised. "Neither is theft, fraud, or conspiracy to commit genocide against honest miners and their families." The standoff stretched taut as wire with violence hanging in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. Then Pike made the fatal mistake of reaching for his gun, apparently believing that speed and surprise could still save him from the consequences of his actions. He was wrong. The Apache warriors moved like shadows, given form disarming Pike's men before they could clear leather, while Cheveo's rifle barrel came to rest against Pike's forehead with the certainty of divine judgment. "It's over," Elise said quietly, stepping forward with the documents that would destroy Pike's empire and restore justice to a territory that had suffered under his corruption for far too long. "Your crimes are exposed, your influence is broken, and your victims will finally receive the justice they deserved." Pike's arrest and trial became the sensation of the territory, with newspapers from as far away as San Francisco covering the proceedings that revealed the full extent of his criminal enterprise. The documents Henry had hidden provided overwhelming evidence of systematic murder fraud and theft stretching back nearly a decade. Felix's inheritance was restored in full, making him one of the wealthiest young men in Arizona Territory. But more importantly, the evidence led to comprehensive reforms that protected other miners' families from similar exploitation. The Copper Gulch cave-in was officially reclassified as an act of industrial murder, and the families of the 17 victims received substantial compensation from Pike's seized assets. Pike himself was tried, convicted, and executed for multiple counts of murder, though he went to his death, maintaining that he had been acting in the territory's best economic interests. Few mourned his passing, and even fewer missed the reign of terror he had imposed on honest working people. Sheriff Crowther was arrested as an accessory and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, his badge stripped and his reputation destroyed by the revelation of his role in Pike's crimes. The cleanup of corruption in Willow Springs took months, but it resulted in a government that actually served its citizens rather than exploiting them. 1 year later, Elise stood on the porch of the comfortable home they had built near the river, watching Chevello teach Felix to train horses in the corral they had constructed with funds from the boy's restored inheritance. The house was larger than anything she had ever imagined living in, with glass windows that let in streams of golden light and a kitchen that was the envy of every woman in the territory. But more important than the physical comfort was the peace that had settled over their lives, like a warm blanket. Felix had grown tall and confident under his adoptive father's guidance, equally comfortable with Apache traditions and the responsibilities that came with his substantial inheritance. At 9 years old, he was fluent in both Apache and English, at home in traditional clothing and business suits, equally comfortable on the reservation and in the territorial capital, where his business interests required periodic attention. The Donovan Mining Company, now managed by a board of trustees, until Felix came of age, had become a model for fair labor practices and environmental responsibility throughout the territory. Water rights that Pike had stolen were returned to the communities that needed them, and the cooperative spirit that had saved Felix was spreading to other regions where honest people were learning to work together against corruption and exploitation. Mama. Felix called, running toward her with excitement lighting his face like sunshine after storm clouds. Come see what Papa taught me. I can make thunder respond to Apache commands now, and he says I'm ready to start learning advanced riding techniques. She smiled at the easy way he used both languages and both sets of traditions, adapting to his dual heritage with the remarkable flexibility of youth. He had learned to move between worlds with grace and confidence, bringing the best of both cultures to everything he did. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, following him to where Chevello was working with a magnificent black stallion that had been a gift from Hotham. But remember, we have the celebration this evening, and there will be important guests who will want to meet you. The entire community was gathering to commemorate not just the anniversary of their marriage, but the broader success of cooperation between Apache and Anglo communities that their union had helped to inspire. What had begun as a desperate expedient to protect one child had grown into something that was healing old wounds and building new possibilities for the future. Territorial officials, tribal leaders, and ordinary families from across Arizona were coming to celebrate what newspapers were calling the Willow Springs miracle, proof that people of different backgrounds could work together for the common good when they chose cooperation over conflict. Dr. Hale approached as they were setting up tables for the feast, his medical bag replaced by a bundle of newspapers from back east, and a satisfied expression that spoke of battles won and justice served. More coverage of Felix's story, he announced with obvious pleasure. Seems your example is inspiring similar cooperation in other territories. There's talk of federal legislation to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation Pike perpetrated, and several mining companies are adopting the fair labor practices you've pioneered. Beatrice joined them, carrying armloads of flowers for the table decorations and wearing a smile that had become increasingly common since Pike's downfall had freed her to teach without interference from corrupt authorities. The new school enrollment numbers came in today, she reported happily. We now have children from 5 different tribes attending classes alongside the Anglo children, and their parents are working together on everything from curriculum development to playground construction. It's exactly what education should be, bringing people together rather than driving them apart. But the most meaningful recognition came as the sun began to set behind the western peaks, and Hotham called for silence before the assembled crowd. The old chief had aged visibly in the past year, but his voice still carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime leading his people through difficulties that would have broken lesser men. Young Eagle, he said formally, gesturing for Felix to step forward before the gathered crowd. You have grown strong in the traditions of your people, and wise in the ways of both worlds that shaped you. Your father Marcus would be proud of the young man you are becoming, as would Henry, who sacrificed everything to protect you and preserve the truth. Felix stood straight and tall, his young face serious as he faced the crowd of people who had gathered to honor his family's journey from desperation to triumph. When he spoke, his clear voice carried across the gathering with confidence that would have been impossible just 1 year before. I want to thank everyone who helped save me and my family. He said, his words carefully chosen but delivered with genuine emotion. But most of all, I want to thank my parents, my mother, who chose to love me when I needed a home, and my father, who taught me that true strength comes from protecting others, not from taking what belongs to them. He turned to look directly at Chevello, and Elise, tears shining in his eyes, but his voice remaining steady. You showed me that family isn't about blood or money or what people expect from you. It's about choosing to stand together no matter what comes about, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. Thank you for choosing me, for fighting for me, and for showing me what it means to be truly loved. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever, but Elise barely heard it. She was too focused on the miracle of the moment, this brave, intelligent, compassionate young man who had grown from a frightened orphan into someone who understood both his heritage and his responsibilities, someone who would use his wealth and position to help others rather than exploit them. As the celebration continued into the night and children played together regardless of their heritage, Elise reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with terror and desperation, with a runaway horse that had nearly destroyed everything she held dear. But that moment of crisis had also been the beginning of their salvation, bringing Chevello into their lives, and setting in motion the events that had saved not just Felix, but an entire community from corruption and exploitation. The future stretched before them, bright with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Felix would grow up to inherit not just wealth, but wisdom about how to use that wealth responsibly. Chevello had found healing from his terrible losses by choosing to protect new love rather than dwelling on old grief. And she had discovered that courage, when combined with the right allies, could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression and corruption. Under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by the warmth of genuine community and the love of family chosen rather than merely inherited, they had found something more precious than silver or water rights or legal recognition. They had found home and hope and the kind of belonging that no amount of wealth could purchase, but that no amount of adversity could destroy. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had watched over the Apache people for countless generations and would continue to watch over the new world they were building. Together, a world where children could grow up without fear, where honest work was rewarded fairly, and where love could bridge any divide that hatred had created.